Ethan Wallace wasn't reckless. That's the part that makes this harder to believe. He wasn't the kind of teen who wandered off into the wild with no plan, no backup, or no clue. 17, honor roll student, varsity track runner, and a hiking enthusiast since he was 9. He planned everything. From the gear in his day pack to the granola bars he kept in Ziplocs labeled by expiration date, Ethan lived by order. So when he told his parents he was heading out for a half-day hike on the Siphon Draw Trail during spring break of 2023, they didn't worry. It was supposed to be a break from AP tests, college applications, and the noise of a fast world. A quiet hike, alone in the desert, just him, his phone, and the trail. He left at 6:32 a.m. on March 12th, driving the family's second car, a silver 2011 Honda Civic, about 45 minutes from their Scottsdale home to the edge of the Superstition wilderness. His mother found the note later, scrawled on the corner of a phone bill envelope. Gone hiking, back before dark. Love you. At 3:17 p.m., he posted his last known selfie on Instagram. A wide shot taken with a phone timer, him perched on a jagged rock formation halfway up the trail. His caption was simple. Quiet up here. The photo looked peaceful, no distress, no storm clouds, just red rock, blue sky, and a kid in a faded hoodie smiling into the wind. By 7:45 p.m., the sun had set, and Ethan still hadn't come home. At first, his parents assumed he'd lost track of time. Maybe no cell service, maybe he'd stopped to rest. But as the hours dragged past dinner, panic began to settle in. Calls went straight to voicemail. Texts were never read. By 9:03 p.m., his father was driving the dark highway out to Lost Dutchman State Park. When he got there, the Honda was still parked in its original spot, doors locked, keys gone. The ranger station was closed, no sign of Ethan, just a car sitting in the dark collecting desert dust. The official search began just after midnight. 2 deputies from the Pinal County Sheriff's Office filed the missing persons report and logged Ethan as a critical overdue hiker due to age and terrain. Within 6 hours, SAR teams were assembled. Drones were prepped, helicopters were requested. The Superstition Mountains weren't known for kindness. They were known for disorienting even seasoned adults, swallowing up hikers in sinkholes, rattlesnake pits, and crumbling ledges. But Ethan knew these trails. He'd been here 3 times just that year. By sunrise, his mother had posted a photo on Facebook. Please, if you've seen our son Ethan Wallace, contact authorities immediately. He left for a hike and hasn't come home. That post was shared 17,000 times by the end of the day. The ranger who first inspected the Civic noted there was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry, no blood or strange items in or around the vehicle. Inside, they found his empty snack wrappers, a neatly folded trail map, and a half-empty bottle of Gatorade. His backpack, water pouch, camera drone, and hiking stick, gone with him. What concerned searchers almost immediately was the weather. The desert had reached 93 degrees by early afternoon. Heat stroke, dehydration, hallucinations, all too common for hikers who misjudged the terrain. But again, Ethan wasn't like most hikers. He always brought more water than necessary. He had a solar-powered battery pack for his phone. He'd once given a classroom presentation on surviving cactus dehydration and snake bite. None of it made sense. For the next 48 hours, hundreds of volunteers combed the area around Siphon Draw. Bloodhounds were flown in from Colorado. Helicopters scanned with infrared. Rangers rappelled from cliffs and scoured dry riverbeds. They found nothing, not a footprint, not a trail of gear, not even dropped trash. It was as if he had vanished into the rocks and left the world behind. On the third day, a ranger said quietly to a deputy, "It's like he never left the parking lot." But he had. They knew he had. The Instagram selfie proved it. Still, it begged the question, how could a 17-year-old, in broad daylight, on a heavily trafficked spring break trail, disappear without a single person seeing him again? By the end of the week, the official tone began to shift. The words, "foul play," were first uttered at a press briefing on March 17th. The sheriff's department noted that although no evidence had been found of a crime, They could not rule out the possibility that Ethan had encountered someone along the trail, someone who didn't want to be found, or someone Ethan had agreed to meet. That night, his sister Claire, 2 years older and back home from college, looked at Ethan's Instagram post again. Something felt off, not in the photo itself, but in what wasn't in it. Ethan always tagged the trail. This time, he hadn't. He always geotagged his location. This time, he didn't. She stared at the photo for almost an hour before noticing it, the rock behind him. It didn't match any formation she recognized from the siphon draw trail, not even close, which meant wherever Ethan had taken that photo, he had already gone off trail. And from that moment, the search would never be the same. The first full night without Ethan passed in silence. His phone remained offline. No pings, no GPS, no bank activity. By 6:30 the next morning, the Wallace family was back at the trailhead, his father pacing the dirt near Ethan's parked car, his mother staring out at the jagged red horizon like the desert might offer her son back. A deputy met them just after dawn and took the full report. Missing hiker, minor, known trail, 8 hours overdue, no signs of return. From that moment, the wheels began turning. Within hours, Pinal County Sheriff's Office coordinated with Superstition Search and Rescue. Rangers launched a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging just after 10 a.m. From the air, they scanned valleys and ridgelines for heat signatures that could indicate a human body, alive or not. A second crew prepared horses and all-terrain vehicles. Drone teams reviewed the latest satellite flyovers. Volunteers began gathering at the ranger station. Ethan's photo was printed and taped on every door. Tan hoodie, dark cargo pants, blue trail shoes, 17, 5'9", 147 pounds. Last seen smiling. Temperatures were climbing fast. By noon, it was 91 degrees in the shade. Hikers were told to stay off the trail. First responders rotated out every 3 hours to avoid collapse. It wasn't just the heat, it was the silence. No footprints, no scattered gear, no indication Ethan had ever left the trail. And yet, the Instagram photo proved he had. By day's end, over 60 searchers had combed the region within a 5-mile radius of the parking lot. Trained dogs were brought in from Flagstaff. The Wallace family had hoped that maybe somehow Ethan had twisted an ankle and was waiting under a rock ledge somewhere, conserving water like he'd been trained to do. But as night fell again, so did their certainty. On the second day, helicopters returned with FLIR cameras, military-grade thermal scanners that could detect the body heat of a rabbit from 500 feet. The sweep covered more than 30 square miles, looping over the rugged face of Flatiron and spilling into the deeper, more dangerous ravines past Siphon Draw. Every shadow was checked, every outcrop was revisited. But the heat sensors picked up nothing that wasn't native to the desert. Foot teams began searching off-path zones, places hikers don't typically go. Steep shale slopes, dry riverbeds, narrow crevices, still nothing, not even trash. Search and Rescue Captain Jason Corley later said it was like Ethan had dropped off the face of the earth without making a sound. That evening, officials raised the alert level. They reclassified the mission from lost hiker to critical disappearance. The media started circling the story. A local news anchor interviewed hikers who'd been on the same trail that Sunday. No one reported seeing a teen alone. No one recognized his photo. One woman said she thought she might have seen someone far ahead of her on the rocks, but she couldn't be sure. That night, a third dog team swept the trailhead and upper ridgeline. Cadaver dogs. But they didn't react, not once. And still, the desert gave nothing back. By day 4, hope began to erode. Claire, Ethan's sister, refused to sit still. She printed out enlarged topographic maps, tracing every possible detour, every canyon that branched off from the main trail. She questioned search team leaders, cross-referenced his last Instagram timestamp with weather data and satellite flyovers. Her parents were losing sleep, fading by the hour. But Claire wouldn't stop. She was convinced Ethan hadn't just collapsed somewhere. She believed he'd been led. She wasn't alone in thinking that. On forums like Web Sleuths and Reddit, the armchair detectives arrived. Some suggested heat stroke, that maybe Ethan had started hallucinating and wandered off trail, stripped down, disoriented, and collapsed. Others speculated he had staged his disappearance or that he had met someone who didn't want to be found. A few cruel voices questioned the family directly. Had they really searched his texts? Was he running from something? None of those theories had proof, and proof was the one thing no one had. Not a shoelace, not a torn thread, not a dropped wrapper. On day 5, local authorities tried a new tactic: grid search with infrared drones. They mapped the trail and laid out square zones, each 200 feet by 200 feet, systematically scouring the terrain with both heat sensors and high-res optics. Dozens of volunteers walked those same zones on foot, eyes down, looking for anything: a phone, a water cap, a flash of blue nylon. But nothing turned up. By then, temperatures had hit 97 degrees. Some of the younger searchers had to be pulled out due to dehydration, and the silence of the desert started to get under people's skin. Rangers who'd worked there for decades said this wasn't normal. When hikers went missing, they usually left some trace behind: an SOS, a footprint, a panic call, or a dropped item. Ethan had left nothing, just an Instagram post and a locked car. By day 6, the sheriff's office brought in external analysts, behavioral experts, GPS specialists, cell tower triangulation teams. They reviewed Ethan's phone records. The last ping had come at 3:19 p.m., roughly the same time as the Instagram post. Then, nothing. No calls, no data, as if the device had vanished with him. But one searcher, Mark Talley, a retired Air Force drone operator volunteering with the team, noticed something strange in one of the thermal drone feeds from day 4. A small, single set of footprints, barely visible in the sand, on a flat stretch near a high ridge plateau. The prints led in one direction, and then just stopped. No looping back, no zigzag, no signs of falling, just a trail, and then absence. The team marked the coordinates and scheduled an extraction crew to investigate at first light. And for the first time in a week, they had something to follow. Mark Talley wasn't looking for recognition. He just wanted to help. He'd been following the story quietly since day 1, watching the search unfold on local news and community boards. As a former Air Force drone technician now living in Mesa, he knew the limitations of standard search gear. The terrain in the superstitions wasn't forgiving: dense brush, brutal elevation shifts, narrow canyons that warped GPS and line-of-sight visuals. Thermal drones helped, but they were limited by battery life and range. Mark had spent years running recon over worse landscapes, and now, retired, he used his own high-end drone for search and rescue volunteer work. He wasn't part of any official team. He just showed up. On the 4th morning after Ethan vanished, Mark walked into the base camp near the ranger station and offered to assist. He had a Matrice 300, fitted with dual cameras, one optical, one thermal, and a flight time nearly twice that of the standard-issue drones most SAR teams were using. After a quick briefing and approval from the on-site coordinator, he launched from a rocky patch just west of the main trail. His goal was simple: scan the less trafficked upper zones of the draw, particularly areas beyond the known trail systems. He flew northeast first, sweeping canyons already checked by ground teams. Nothing. Just sun-baked stone and the occasional lizard heat signature. He pivoted north, letting the drone climb to 400 feet, then angled east over a high plateau roughly 2 miles from the original search radius, an area that hadn't yet been mapped by foot due to its inaccessibility. No known trails, no tourist traffic, steep drop-offs on both sides, and then something shifted on his monitor. It wasn't heat that caught his attention. It was shape. A subtle, unnatural pattern across a stretch of undisturbed sand near the edge of a mesa. Mark hovered the drone, zoomed the optical lens, and saw them. Footprints. A single line, faint but unmistakable. Humans, not deep, meaning recent, just one set, no doubling back, no second trail. The prints meandered slightly but maintained a general line. From the direction they began, it looked as though someone had crossed the sandy plateau, directly toward the cliff, and then stopped. Mark hovered longer, recording everything. The prints ended abruptly less than 3 feet from the ledge. He noted the angle of descent, Rough terrain, impossible to climb without gear. No scuffs or slide marks down the cliff face. Nothing below but hard rock and dry air. When he returned to base camp, he pulled aside the SAR coordinator and showed him the footage. The team immediately flagged the coordinates and prepped an airlift to get personnel up top. The area was too remote and too dangerous to access by foot without climbing gear. By early evening, 4 rangers and 1 deputy were flown in and dropped just short of the plateau. They reached the site within an hour. The footprints were still there. The wind hadn't yet claimed them. They were about a men's size 9, Ethan's exact shoe size. Investigators photographed and documented the scene, marking every print. They confirmed the tracks began near a narrow outcrop, likely where someone had climbed up using a small game trail or hidden ridge, and stretched in a loose arc across the flat stone surface toward the edge. There were no return prints. It was the first physical clue in over 4 days, but instead of answers, it raised more questions. Why would Ethan go up there? There was no trail, no shade, no water. The climb was difficult, even dangerous. Has someone lured him? Was he chasing something? Running from someone? And if he reached that spot, why hadn't they found anything else? No pack, no phone, no sign of a fall. Rangers rappelled halfway down the cliff that evening, carefully checking ledges and crevices. Nothing. No broken brush, no snagged clothes. It was as if he had walked to the edge of the world and disappeared. For Ethan's family, the discovery was both a relief and a heartbreak. For the first time, they had something. Proof he'd been there. But the footprints told a story that didn't make sense. He wouldn't have climbed up here without a reason. He wouldn't have gone that close to the edge without caution. Claire reviewed the drone footage frame by frame on a borrowed laptop that night. She kept replaying the moment the prints stopped. Her mind refused to accept the idea that he'd just jumped. It didn't fit. That night, searchers expanded their radius outward from the plateau. They set up new drone flights. They used 3D mapping to recreate the terrain, but no additional tracks were found, no signs of other hikers, no secondary prints, no drag marks, no wheel tracks. The area was isolated, dry, and silent. By morning, the wind had picked up. When rangers returned to the plateau for a follow-up scan, the footprints were gone, blown smooth by desert gusts overnight. Just hours after discovery, the only physical evidence of Ethan's presence had been erased by nature itself. Mark Talley stayed at camp one more night before heading home. He handed off his drone footage, signed the chain of custody, and quietly slipped away without asking for credit. In interviews later, he said he wished he hadn't found those prints, that something about the pattern didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just that they ended. It was the way they ended. Straight, calm, like someone knew exactly where they were going. The story had just taken its first real turn, but no one was prepared for what would come next. By sunrise, the search team was already airborne. The discovery of Ethan's footprints had jolted the operation into a new phase. The coordinates from Mark Talley's drone footage pointed to a sandstone plateau, high, isolated, and unreachable by marked trail. Air support dropped off a team of 5, 2 seasoned rangers, a forensic tech, a sheriff's deputy, and a climber. They moved quickly, knowing how fast the desert could change, and they were right to hurry. Wind was already starting to sweep across the surface, softening the edges of the prints, but they were still visible. A single trail of footprints, roughly size 9, the same tread pattern as Ethan's hiking shoes, verified against a second identical pair found in his room. Each print was spaced with the same stride length, consistent pressure. No erratic movements, no signs of panic. The line was steady, direct. He hadn't been running or limping. Whatever had brought him here, he'd walked calmly to the edge. And that's where it stopped. There were no turnaround prints, no hesitation, no broken rocks, just a final step within 3 feet of the cliff's edge, and then silence. The team fanned out. They scanned the surroundings for dropped items. Nothing. No water bottle, no pack, no phone. The cliff face itself was sheer, sloping down at nearly a 90-degree angle. At the bottom, jagged boulders and hard dirt. But what stunned investigators was the lack of any visible disturbance below. No scuff marks, no torn fabric, no darkened patches indicating a fall. The sand near the base of the cliff was untouched, smooth, undisturbed. If Ethan had jumped or fallen, he would have made an impact. There would have been something. But the scene was sterile. Too sterile. The forensic technician took high-resolution photographs of each footprint. Soil samples were collected. Drones scanned every ridge and ravine in a 3-mile radius. The sheriff's office even brought in a pair of binoculars equipped with image stabilization to visually trace the base of the cliff from different angles. Still, they found nothing. It was as though Ethan had been lifted off the ground and pulled into the sky. The theory of a fall was floated during a briefing that afternoon, but even the most conservative assessment didn't hold. If Ethan had lost his balance or leapt deliberately, gravity would have taken over. The drop was high, but not bottomless. Something, his body, his gear, broken vegetation, should have been visible. Rangers who'd worked dozens of falls said this wasn't normal. One of them said quietly to another, "Even the worst accidents leave something behind." That night, as the team returned to base, Claire stared at the aerial shots in silence. She studied the footprints on the screen and pointed out what none of them had: the direction of the tracks. The sun had been behind Ethan when he walked across that plateau. She knew he always hiked with the sun to his back to reduce glare, which meant when he stepped to the edge, he wasn't just walking, he was looking at something. But what? There was no visible marker, no formation, no signs of movement in the drone footage. It was just barren rock and an endless horizon, a place with no purpose, unless he wasn't alone. The thought made Claire nauseous, but she couldn't shake it. The prints were too neat, too straight, like someone had walked him there. Not with force, there were no scuffle marks, but with intent. A lure, a guide, someone who stayed just out of frame. She brought this theory to the sheriff's office, who politely dismissed it as speculation. They were still classifying the disappearance as a solo hiker incident with unknown outcome. But the detectives were just as disturbed, not by what they found, but by what they hadn't. On the 5th day, a team rappelled down the cliff. They were hoping to find something, anything, caught in a crack, a crevice, even a scrap of clothing wedged between the rocks. But the descent revealed nothing. Every ledge was clean. Every pocket of brush is unbroken. The base showed no signs of human impact. And the only things waiting at the bottom were sun, wind, and stone. It was as though Ethan had walked to the edge of that cliff and simply vanished. The media began circling again, seizing on the mystery. Local news ran headlines calling it the Vanishing Trail. Some labeled it supernatural. Others speculated cult activity, predators, trafficking rings. Ethan's parents refused to engage with any of it. They just wanted answers, real ones. But with each day, the facts thinned and theories multiplied. The only certainty was that Ethan had made it to that plateau, and the only evidence of his presence had already been wiped away by nature's hand. Investigators reviewed satellite data again. They checked for seismic activity, sinkholes, and unmarked caves. Geological experts were consulted. The terrain was mapped down to the centimeter. No new information emerged. The cliff remained the same, imposing, barren, and silent. On the 7th day, one of the searchers, an off-duty firefighter volunteering his time, stood at the cliff edge right where Ethan's last footprint had been. He stared out over the valley below, eyes scanning the horizon, and whispered, almost to himself, "Why would anyone come here?" There was no answer, just heat and wind, and the sound of nothing at all. By the end of the first week, Ethan Wallace wasn't just a missing person. He was a mystery, one that had captured the imagination of strangers around the country. What had started as a local search and rescue effort had quietly evolved into something else entirely, a cold case forming in real time. With every passing hour that brought no new clue, people filled the silence with speculation. And theories, some grounded, some impossible, started to grow. The official stance from the Pinal County Sheriff's Office remained cautious. They classified the case as open and active, but admitted that beyond the footprints, they had no physical evidence to move forward. Internally, Investigators are divided into theory groups. The most common hypothesis was environmental disorientation. It happens more often than people think. A hiker misjudges the heat, becomes dehydrated, suffers confusion, and walks off trail. Sometimes they climb for better visibility, then collapse. Sometimes they wander into terrain they can't escape. In most cases, the body is recovered days or weeks later. But Ethan's case didn't quite fit. He was young, fit, and smart. He knew the terrain. He had the gear, and most importantly, there was no trace of a collapse, no sign of circling or erratic walking. His footprints went in a straight line to the edge of a cliff and ended. Not in panic, not in chaos. It just ended. Still, search leaders publicly leaned toward heat-related disorientation. It was the most logical option. Unprovable, yes, but better than nothing. But logic doesn't always survive public interest. Online forums exploded. Reddit threads analyzed satellite photos and terrain models. TikTok sleuths made compilation videos connecting Ethan's disappearance to other unsolved hiker cases in the same region. Some speculated he had fallen into a hidden crevice or a mine shaft. Others swore there had to be someone else involved, someone who had led him there. The theories multiplied. Some said Ethan had staged his disappearance, that he'd wanted to escape. Maybe stress, pressure, a secret life no one knew about. They pointed to his choice to hike alone. The remote area, the lack of gear recovered. But that theory crumbled quickly. His bank account was untouched, his passport was at home, and his online presence didn't show any signs of withdrawal. No coded messages, no farewells. Others suggested suicide, the cliff, the final footsteps. But that theory felt thin. Investigators reviewed his recent social media activity. Just hours before his disappearance, Ethan had posted that trail selfie, smiling, captioned, "Quiet up here." That same morning, he had messaged a friend about a photography scholarship he'd been awarded, one he'd been working toward for months. He talked about summer plans, college visits. There were no signs of depression, no dark journals, nothing that hinted at that kind of decision. His family was adamant. Ethan was excited about life. His future was unfolding. Then there were the stranger theories, animal attack, a sudden ambush by a mountain lion or coyote, but that didn't match the evidence either. There was no blood, no drag marks, no scattered gear. Wild animals don't erase footprints. They leave scenes behind. A few people suggested spontaneous human combustion, completely outlandish with no scientific basis, but it made the rounds in fringe communities. Others claimed vortexes, alien abduction, supernatural disappearances. Claire tried not to read them, but sometimes she couldn't help herself. The obsession with Ethan wasn't about him anymore. It was about the void he left behind. What really disturbed Claire was what wasn't found. His GoPro, his drone, his water pack, all missing. Ethan documented every hike, every summit. He carried backup batteries, memory cards. He'd filmed his own rescue from a flash flood the year before and uploaded the footage online. So why, on the hike where he vanished, was there not a single photo, clip, or file? She asked investigators whether his phone could have been remotely wiped. They said it was possible, but unlikely without access to the device. The last cell ping came just after the Instagram post. Then, total silence. No outgoing data, no tracking. And since the device was never found, there was no way to confirm what was on it or what might have been erased. Claire became obsessed with digital traces. She reread every comment, every DM, every like on Ethan's last posts. Most were innocent. Some were creepy. One stood out, a burner account that left a comment on one of Ethan's older hiking videos just 4 days before he vanished. It simply said, "Bet you haven't found the cave yet." The account was deleted before she could trace it. When she brought it to the police, they logged it, but couldn't track its origin. IP data was scrubbed, no user history. It was a dead end. She didn't tell her parents about it. They were barely sleeping. Every time the phone rang, they froze. Every time the doorbell chimed, they braced for news. But it never came. Instead, theories kept growing. One hiker claimed to have seen a figure watching them from a ridge days after the disappearance. But the timeline didn't line up. Another said they found a torn strap in a gully, but it didn't match Ethan's gear. Every supposed clue led nowhere. Even after search teams withdrew, Claire stayed active. She kept posting. She created a tip line. She offered rewards. But deep down, she was starting to feel what investigators had already begun to accept. Ethan's case wasn't just unsolved. It was starting to look unsolvable. And yet, there was still that question no one could answer. If Ethan had vanished at the edge of that cliff, where were the things he carried? Claire Wallace didn't grieve the way most people expected. She didn't cry in front of cameras or disappear behind closed doors. Instead, she opened every device her brother had left behind and started pulling threads. Ethan's laptop, his backup drive, the tablet he barely used, she turned each one into an evidence locker. Not because she had experience, but because no one else was doing it. The police had already shifted focus. Search teams were down to skeleton crews. The official updates had stopped. Her parents could barely speak most days, and the world had started moving on. But Claire wasn't ready to accept that a smart, organized, experienced hiker had just walked to the edge of a cliff and vanished. She started with his phone records. What few logs they had were basic, mostly texts to friends, a few normal calls, nothing suspicious. But Claire knew Ethan. He didn't use text the way others did. He messaged over apps, Instagram, Snapchat, encrypted DMs. She remembered one thing in particular. Ethan had posted a story on Snapchat 2 days before the hike. A screenshot of a topographic map with a caption, "Off trail might be worth it." It disappeared after 24 hours. She hadn't saved it, but it stayed in her mind like a breadcrumb. She logged into his Snapchat account using his desktop browser. Cache. Most chats were gone, but one remained in fragments, sent from an account with no profile picture and a random string of characters for a username. The messages had all been deleted, except for a single line Ethan had sent back. "How far off trail?" The burner account never replied. It had been deleted 2 hours after Ethan went missing. Claire took screenshots, then tried to trace the IP through third-party tools. No luck. Whatever this account was, it was made to disappear. She handed everything to the sheriff's office, but they told her there was no viable data trail. Without a subpoena and with the account already deleted, there was nothing to follow. But Claire couldn't let it go. Something about that phrase, "off trail might be worth it," kept repeating in her head. It sounded like a dare or a challenge. She dug deeper. Ethan had used an old GPS watch that logged his hikes. Most of the recent data had synced to a cloud account. Claire managed to access it. The last 3 saved treks were all in the Superstition Wilderness, each gradually veering farther from the marked trail systems. The last one, recorded 3 weeks before he vanished, ended abruptly in a dead zone, near a canyon marked only with a vague park code. When she overlaid the map on satellite terrain, it aligned loosely with the region where the drone had captured Ethan's footprints. Ethan had been exploring that area before, quietly, without telling anyone. She began messaging other hikers on forums he'd visited. One user remembered talking to Ethan a month prior. Nothing strange, just a general question about unlisted trailheads near the water caves. That word again. Caves. When Claire asked for more, the user said there were rumors of abandoned mines or hidden springs deeper in the northern hills. Most people ignored them. Too dangerous, too remote. But not Ethan. The more she searched, the more the pattern emerged. He'd been planning something. Not a disappearance, not an escape, a discovery. He'd found something, or believed he had. And someone knew it. She went back through his photos. Ethan had taken hundreds, some public, most private. Claire sorted them by GPS metadata. One photo stood out. It was dated 4 days before his hike. The file had been saved offline, not posted anywhere. It showed a cave mouth, dark, half buried behind scrub brush, framed by rock layers not typical of the usual hiking trails. No coordinates, no caption. But it wasn't a tourist spot. She knew Ethan's photo style. He always centered his subject. But in this one, the cave entrance was slightly off-center, like he hadn't meant to photograph it but caught it by accident. Claire printed the image and showed it to a retired ranger she'd met during the early searches. He studied it quietly, then said it looked like a collapsed runoff tunnel, possibly natural, possibly old mining. Most had been sealed off decades ago, but a few still existed, unmarked and half swallowed by the desert, illegal to enter, nearly impossible to find. But if someone had been looking, Claire asked if anyone had ever mapped them. The ranger shook his head, not publicly, but he admitted one thing. If Ethan had gone inside and something had happened, they'd never find him. The thought haunted her. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she pictured Ethan standing at the edge of that cliff, not confused, not scared, but searching. For what, she didn't know, but someone else had known, someone who told him to go, someone who vanished just as fast as he did. Claire compiled all the findings into a digital timeline. She labeled every interaction, every trace, every breadcrumb. She sent copies to the sheriff's office, to journalists, even to private investigators. Most never replied. One detective said the messages were interesting, but not actionable. The burner account, the cave image, the off-trail GPS logs, none of it proved foul play. It just proved curiosity. But Claire knew her brother. He wouldn't have walked toward the unknown without a reason, and whatever that reason was, it had vanished with him. What she didn't know, not yet, was that one of the drone frames from day 4, buried in a folder she hadn't opened, contained a shadow in the rocks behind Ethan's last known path. A figure. Crouched. Watching. Claire had reached the point where she no longer trusted maps. The official ones felt useless now. Colorful outlines of approved trails, safe zones, and tourist loops that never went far enough. But Ethan hadn't stuck to those. He'd gone off route, followed by something unseen. And every day that passed, Claire grew more certain that the answers weren't in the places people were willing to look. So she started going where they wouldn't. She returned to the Superstition Mountains in early April, almost a full month after Ethan vanished. The search crews were gone. Only faded caution tape and trampled brush marked where they had once camped. She wasn't alone this time. A man named Travis Weller, a survivalist YouTuber who'd followed the case online, offered to help. He wasn't just a hiker. He was someone who specialized in disappearances in wild places, and he had spent years exploring the terrain around the Superstitions. His videos had modest followings, mostly about gear tips and off-grid survival. But his reputation was solid, and more importantly, he knew what to look for. Claire shared everything she had. The burner message about a hidden water cave, the GPS trail that ended just shy of the plateau, the photo of the cave mouth Ethan had never posted. Travis was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that stuck with her. "There's a reason the cave isn't on the map. The old ones never are." The two of them studied elevation data and satellite overlays, cross-referencing the old trail maps with user-generated posts on obscure forums. Travis noted something unusual near the cliff where Ethan's footprints ended. A narrow depression in the rock face that didn't match the geological slope. It wasn't deep, but it was continuous, like something had once passed through it regularly. An old runoff path, maybe, or an animal trail. They set out on foot at sunrise, avoiding the official trail completely. Claire wore Ethan's old hiking boots, half a size too big but familiar. The air was sharp with dust, the wind carrying old scents of creosote and sunburned stone. They hiked for nearly 4 hours before the terrain changed. The slope steepened, and the brush thinned. And that's when Travis spotted it. A path, barely visible, not a trail, not something cleared by hikers, but a faint indentation that dipped down along the cliffside, hidden beneath layers of dried vegetation and loose rock. It wasn't wide enough for foot traffic unless you were willing to crouch or slide. But something, or someone, had been through there. Recently. They followed the path down in silence. The farther they went, the quieter it got. The air changed too, cooler, shaded by the cliff above. Claire's heart pounded with every step. She scanned the ground obsessively, hoping for some sign that Ethan had come this way. A torn strap, a boot print, a piece of fabric. anything. They were halfway down when Travis stopped suddenly and crouched. At the base of a cluster of rocks, tangled in dry thorns, was a scrap of blue nylon, weathered, frayed at the edge, and coated in fine dust. It was the same color as Ethan's backpack. Claire didn't speak. She just stared at it, her breath caught in her chest. Travis carefully pulled it free and held it to the light. No tag, no markings, just fabric. But the material was thick, structured like part of a gear pack, something designed for utility, something Ethan would have worn. They marked the location and took photos from every angle. Claire wanted to scream. She wanted to climb down the rest of the way herself. But Travis stopped her. The winds were starting to pick up, too dangerous to descend without proper anchor points. The last thing they needed was another person missing. They hiked back in silence and turned over the fabric to the authorities that evening. Rangers returned to the site the next morning, this time with ropes, cameras, and climbing gear. But it was too late. The winds had blown hard overnight, twisting through the cliffs, sweeping away dust and surface clues. Any footprints that might have been there were now erased. The team did a partial descent, logging the surrounding rock face and searching for openings. They found a narrow crevice midway down, partially collapsed, barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through. It dropped into shadow, beyond visible reach. Too dangerous to enter without clearance. The site was flagged but not explored. The rangers called it unstable, high risk, low reward. Claire begged them to send a drone down the gap, but the angle was too steep. GPS and signal control were unreliable that close to the rock face. And without more evidence, they said, there was no justification for a full-scale excavation. To them, it was a coincidence. To Claire, it was proof. That night, she sat in her car for hours, parked near the Adaru base of the trail, staring up at the cliffs. Somewhere beneath them, buried in layers of stone and silence, was the truth. A truth the desert had swallowed. And as the wind picked up again, whispering across the gravel, she realized something Ethan had probably learned too late. Once you leave the trail, no one comes looking in the right places. It had been 63 days since Ethan Wallace disappeared when the call came in. A hiker named Ray Collins had been driving along a remote service road east of the Superstition Cliff Base, a stretch most visitors never even knew existed. It was a clear afternoon in early May. He'd just finished a solo hike and was heading back to the highway when something caught his eye. A white Jeep Cherokee parked about 50 yards off the road, tucked behind a dead juniper tree. Nothing unusual at first, but then he saw the driver. The man was standing outside the Jeep, facing the cliffs, holding binoculars, just staring, not moving, not adjusting his stance, just fixated on the horizon where the plateau met the sky. At first, Ray thought maybe he was bird-watching, but the posture didn't match. It wasn't casual. It was expectant, intent, like someone waiting for something, or someone. Ray slowed down as he passed, expecting a nod or some acknowledgement, but the man didn't react. Not a glance, no movement, just binoculars to his face, locked onto the landscape. The moment stuck with Ray. It felt off. His dashcam was running, as it always was. So when he got home, curiosity got the better of him. He reviewed the footage. Frame by frame, he watched the white Jeep come into view. The make was unmistakable. Older model, probably late 90s, license plate dusty but partially legible. The man's face was turned, mostly obscured, but a few details stood out. Short hair, possibly graying, military posture, thin building, and one detail Ray hadn't noticed in person, a sidearm strapped to his thigh. He filed a report the next day, not because he thought it was urgent, but because he'd remembered the Ethan Wallace case, and something about that man's stillness had unsettled him. The sheriff's office responded within 24 hours. They ran the partial plates through DMV records. The results raised immediate flags. The vehicle had been registered to a man named Daniel Rourke, retired military, 54 years old, listed as deceased. No active forwarding address, no next of kin, no digital footprint. Claire was contacted the next day. The investigators didn't tell her much at first, just that they had a new lead, something they needed to verify. When she learned about the Jeep, the man with the binoculars, and the direction he'd been watching, straight toward the cliff where Ethan's trail had ended. Something clicked. The footage was grainy, but she recognized something in the stance. Not in the man himself, but in the deliberate stillness. Ethan had captured a similar posture once, filming a time-lapse of wildlife during a trip in Zion. A man in the background had stood frozen for nearly 5 minutes without moving. It had given Claire chills when she first noticed it. She never thought she'd see it again. The sheriff's department dug deeper into Daniel Rourke's background. What they found didn't make sense. He had served in a reconnaissance unit during the Gulf War, honorably discharged, no criminal record. But in 2006, he'd been investigated by federal agencies in connection with a string of disappearances in wilderness areas. The files were sealed. No charges were ever filed. And then, just as quickly as he appeared in those reports, his name vanished. According to DMV records, Rourke had declared himself deceased 3 years earlier. A formal death certificate had never been filed, just an administrative note from an out-of-state registry. When agents visited the last known address on file, an old trailer outside of Tucson, it was abandoned, stripped, no personal belongings, no paper trail. The Jeep was never found. Claire asked to view the dashcam footage herself. She watched it dozens of times, studying every pixel. The vehicle matched. The man didn't move. And when Ray's car passed and slowed slightly, the figure finally turned, but not toward the camera. His eyes remained on the plateau. That was what haunted her most. When they asked Ray to return to the location, he agreed. But the Jeep wasn't there anymore. No tire marks, no shell casings, no prints, just dust and scattered gravel. Forensics came up empty. Whatever evidence may have existed had been wiped away by time and wind. Law enforcement quietly admitted they had no grounds to pursue it further. Without proof the man had done anything, there was no legal path to a search, no warrant, no probable cause. Just a feeling that someone had been watching. Claire, though, refused to let it go. She built a timeline with the help of a former FBI analyst who'd followed the case online. Together, they traced Daniel Rourke's movements as best they could through property records, archived trail permits, and drone hobbyist forums. They found a pattern. Rourke had filed multiple temporary BLM campsite requests in remote areas near known disappearances. Most recently, a permit from January 2023. The listed location: a remote patch of desert 12 miles east of the Lost Dutchman trailhead. There was nothing conclusive. But to Claire, it wasn't about proof anymore. It was about possibility. Maybe Ethan hadn't vanished by accident, that maybe someone had been watching long before the day he went missing, and maybe that person, whoever they were, was still out there. Waiting? Still returning to the same ridge, still watching the same place Ethan had walked toward, step by step, until the trail ended. Because some people don't leave footprints, but they always return to where the others did. The shaft had been there all along, half a mile from the cliff base, hidden, behind a ridge of boulders and overgrown brush, not visible from the trail, not listed on any modern maps. It was only when a freelance geologist, mapping historic mine claims for an unrelated land study, flagged its presence that investigators took a second look. An entry, recorded in an 1894 mining ledger, matched the approximate location where the Jeep sighting had occurred weeks earlier. The shaft had no official name, just a claim number. The records listed it as sealed. But when a ranger team went out to verify, they found the wooden barrier collapsed inward and half buried beneath layers of silt and rock. No one knows how long it had been open. A new search was organized within 72 hours. Rangers, sheriff's deputies, and a private cave response team were deployed with high-output lamps, helmets, and climbing harnesses. The shaft sloped down sharply, then widened into a cavern that had long since dried out. Dust clung to the walls like ash. The air was stale. Every sound echoed like a memory. They found the first fragment just inside the threshold, a torn piece of black nylon with faint blue trim. The search leader immediately flagged it for lab review. 15 feet deeper, near a collapsed beam, they uncovered something worse, Wedged between two rocks was a cracked lens, shattered and dirt-caked. It had the unmistakable body shape of a GoPro camera, just without the casing. The memory card slot had been torn open. The card itself was gone. They kept searching. Further in, the cave narrowed again, forcing the team to crawl. One of them, a retired firefighter named Leo, spotted a glint of metal under a layer of compacted dirt. He dug gently with his gloves and pulled out a rusted blade, 4 inches long, hunting style, partially corroded. It was dull, pitted, and old, but the hilt still had remnants of paracord wrapped tightly around it, not store-bought, modified. They bagged it all and turned the area into a sealed crime scene. The next 48 hours were spent processing every inch of the shaft. Ground-penetrating radar revealed no human remains, but decomposition in desert caves is complicated. Bones can be dragged by animals, scattered, or simply lost in collapses. What mattered were the fragments. The nylon strip matched the brand and color of Ethan's hiking pants. Microscopic fiber comparison confirmed it. The tear pattern suggested it had been ripped by force, snagged or pulled, not sliced. The GoPro was harder to trace. The serial number had been partially melted, but the manufacturer verified it had been sold 6 months earlier to a Phoenix sporting goods store. Ethan had bought his camera from the same location. The knife was unregistered, no prints. But DNA swabs taken from the grip came back with 2 profiles. One was degraded and too partial to identify. The other matched Ethan. Claire was called in for a meeting with the lead investigator. The evidence wasn't enough to declare him dead. Not yet. But it was enough to confirm something happened inside that shaft. Something violent. Something that had been hidden, buried beneath layers of dust, darkness, and time. When she saw the GoPro lens, Claire's hands started shaking. She remembered the one he used, strapped to his chest with a harness, his favorite for wide-angle hiking shots. It had been missing since day 1. He never left it behind, and if he brought it with him that day, it meant he'd recorded something. But now the memory card is gone. Whatever he'd seen, whoever he'd followed, whatever happened next, someone had taken steps to erase it. Investigators returned to the shaft 2 more times over the following week. They searched side tunnels and crevices, even the old mining debris for signs of a second person. No prints, no shoe impressions, no personal items, just fragments. Enough to raise questions, never enough to answer them. The theory shifted again. If someone had lured Ethan into that shaft, whether through messages, signs, or manipulation, then they had done so deliberately. The damage to the nylon and the missing camera card suggested a struggle. But no blood was found, no drag marks, and no way to tell how long the evidence had been there before being discovered. For Claire, the cave became the center of everything. She requested copies of the crime scene photos. She printed them out, taped them across her bedroom wall, drawing lines between objects like puzzle pieces. The torn nylon, the missing card, the knife with 2 sets of DNA. There was enough there to say it wasn't random, not a simple fall, not a lost hiker who collapsed from heat stroke. Someone else had been there. The same way someone had created the burner account, the same way someone had been watching the cliffs from the Jeep. The signs were scattered, incomplete, but together they told a story. One that no one wanted to say out loud, because you don't just find Ethan's belongings in a mine shaft unless he went in there, or was taken. And if he was taken, the silence surrounding the case wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a cover. It arrived without a return address, a plain manila envelope, postmarked from Albuquerque with no sender listed. Claire almost threw it out. Another sympathy letter maybe, or some wild theory from someone online claiming they knew what had happened. But something made her open it. Inside was no letter, no explanation, just a single photograph printed on glossy paper, grainy, washed out, slightly curled at the corners. At first glance, it looked like one of the original drone stills from day 4 of the search, the high-altitude image that showed Ethan's footprints leading across the plateau. Claire had seen it before. Everyone had. But something about this version was different. It was zoomed in, focused on the top right corner where the last few prints curved toward the edge. She brought it closer to the light. Her heart stopped. There was someone there. Not Ethan. A second figure. barely visible behind a large boulder near the cliff's edge. The silhouette crouched low, partially concealed by shadow. The body position was unnatural, too still to be casual, too purposeful to be accidental. The image resolution was poor, but one detail stood out: a wide-brimmed hat, like the kind field workers or hikers sometimes wore to block the sun. The figure's face was completely hidden. But it wasn't just hiding. I watched it. Claire stared at it for nearly 10 minutes without blinking. She traced the trail of Ethan's footprints on the image, step by step. They curved, not sharply, but enough to shift, not toward the cliff, but toward the boulder, toward him. She scanned the envelope again, searching for anything. Fingerprints, smudges, a note, nothing. Whoever sent it had gone to great lengths to avoid detection. No postmark trail beyond the city, no digital watermark on the print. The image wasn't new. It had to have come from the original batch of drone footage recorded by Mark Talley on day 4, but this frame had never been shared publicly. Not like this. She brought the photo to the sheriff's office the next morning. The lead investigator stared at it, his expression unreadable. He admitted he'd never seen the zoomed-in version before. They pulled up the raw drone files, running frame-by-frame analysis. It was there, buried in the margins of the original footage. A few pixels, something no one had caught in real time. The outline had been dismissed as a rock shadow, a trick of light, but once isolated, once enhanced, the shape became unmistakable. A person, crouched, watching, still. And then the realization came. This wasn't after Ethan had passed. The timestamp on the drone frame matched the moment Ethan had been walking. That meant this figure had been there before he reached the edge. Waiting. Hiding. No law enforcement agency could confirm the figure's identity. The resolution was too low. The image was too compromised. Facial recognition software returned nothing. There was no movement, no face, no action caught on tape. Just a moment. One that changed everything. Claire asked a question that no one wanted to answer. Had the search team missed a second person on the plateau? Had someone been watching the entire time, just out of frame, vanishing before the helicopters arrived? Privately, one ranger admitted that the drone's initial pass over the area had been brief, less than 2 minutes, before moving on to sweep the wider zone. They hadn't reviewed the stills in detail until much later. And by the time the team was dropped in, any tracks or clues left by a second person could have already been erased by the wind. The image was quietly added to the case file, but no public statements were made. Authorities didn't want to fuel conspiracy theories or create panic. They still had no suspects, no identity, no context, just the presence of a second figure, and the haunting fact that Ethan's last known movement led straight toward him. Claire posted the image online 2 days later. Not the original, but a redacted version. Blurred, cropped, just enough to let people see what she'd seen. It spread fast. Some called it fake. Others believed it was proof of something darker, evidence that Ethan hadn't been alone, that someone had lured him, that his disappearance wasn't an accident. But the figure in the image never moved, never looked up, never ran. He was simply there, present. A shadow burned into the final moment of Ethan's known existence. No new leads came from the photo, no confessions, no matching sightings. Daniel Rourke's name surfaced again in some circles, but without evidence, he remained just another ghost in the background of a case full of them. Claire kept the photo next to her bed. Not as closure, but it's true. A silent, blurry witness to something no one could explain. Proof that Ethan hadn't just walked into the desert and vanished, that there had been someone else, that at least one person knew what happened out there and chose to disappear just as effectively. Today, the official record still classifies Ethan Wallace as a missing person. His case remains open but unsolved. The Superstition Mountains have returned to silence, and hikers walk those same trails, unaware of the story buried beneath the dust. Occasionally, visitors leave behind stones with Ethan's name near the trailhead, a tribute, a question that never found its answer, and somewhere, maybe far from the cliffs, maybe not far at all, someone still watches. The last known image says everything. Ethan didn't vanish alone.